There is a food that the Inca Empire called the mother of all grains. Their emperor planted the first seeds of each season with a golden spade in a sacred ceremony. They offered it to their sun god. They fed it to their armies on the longest marches in the ancient Americas. And then the Spanish arrived and tried to erase it from the face of the earth. They failed. The grain survived, hidden in the mountain communities of the Andes for 500 years. And then, in one of the most remarkable food stories of modern times, it came back. From obscure Andean staple to global superfood in the space of a few decades. A food that empires tried to destroy is now on the menu of every health food restaurant in the world. But before we get to empires and conquistadors and superfoods, we need to go back to the beginning, to the high Andes Mountains of South America, to the shores of Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake in the world, sitting 4,000 meters above sea level on the border between modern Peru and Bolivia. Wild quinoa plants have been growing in this region for tens of thousands of years, but human cultivation of quinoa began approximately 7,000 years ago. The ancient peoples of the Lake Titicaca Basin were among the first to recognize something extraordinary about this plant. It could grow at altitudes where almost nothing else could survive. At 4,000 meters, most crops fail. Quinoa thrives. The quinoa plant is technically not a grain at all. It is a chenopod, a relative of spinach and beets, rather than a true grass. When we eat quinoa, we are eating the seeds, but those seeds are so nutritionally complete that calling them mere seeds feels like an understatement. Quinoa contains all 9 essential amino acids that the human body needs but cannot produce itself. This makes it one of very few plant foods that is a complete protein. The ancient peoples of the Lake Titicaca Basin understood empirically what modern nutrition science has confirmed chemically. They knew that quinoa could sustain a person with extraordinary completeness, that people eating quinoa were strong and healthy, even at altitudes where the thin air made physical work enormously demanding. Over generations, they selected the best plants, the most productive, the most flavorful, the most nutritious. By the time the Inca civilization rose to dominance in the 15th century, quinoa had been cultivated for 6,000 years. It was already a sophisticated, varied crop with hundreds of different varieties adapted to different altitudes, different climates, different soil types. Some varieties were white, some were red, some were black, some were orange. The Inca inherited 6,000 years of agricultural wisdom. The Inca called quinoa Chisaya Mama, which means mother grain. This was not just a nickname. It expressed a profound relationship. The Inca believed that quinoa was a gift from Inti, their sun god. the most powerful deity in their religion. A food given by the god of the sun was not just nutrition, it was divine sustenance, it was sacred, and it was treated accordingly. The Inca emperor was called the Sapa Inca, the only Inca, the supreme ruler, who was considered a divine son of the sun. Every year, at the planting season, the Sapa Inca himself performed the first planting of quinoa. He used a golden spade. He planted the first seeds in a field near Cusco, the Inca capital. This ceremony was observed by thousands. It opened the agricultural year for the entire empire. Quinoa was not just sacred, it was strategically essential. The Inca Empire was the largest empire in pre-Columbian history. At its peak, it stretched over 6,000 kilometers from modern Colombia to modern Chile. It incorporated over 12 million people and dozens of different nations. Running this empire required armies, and feeding those armies in the mountains required quinoa. Inca soldiers could march extraordinary distances through mountain terrain, carrying food made from quinoa. They carried roasted quinoa, called quispino, that was lightweight, calorie-dense, and required no cooking. They carried quinoa flour, mixed with water, to make a simple porridge when they stopped to camp. The ability to move armies quickly through the Andes was partly a food logistics achievement. Quinoa made it possible. The Inca also had an extraordinary storage system called colcas. These were stone storehouses built at regular intervals along the Inca road network. They were positioned at different altitudes to exploit the natural refrigeration of mountain temperatures. Quinoa was stored in colcas, along with dried potatoes and freeze-dried meat. The Inca could feed an entire army or an entire province from these pre-positioned stores. Quinoa also held a special place in Inca medicine. Inca physicians, called amauta, used quinoa preparations for wound healing. Quinoa paste was applied to skin conditions. Quinoa water was given to sick people. And the leaves of the quinoa plant were used to treat various ailments. The Inca understood empirically that quinoa had healing properties. Modern science has since confirmed that quinoa contains anti-inflammatory compounds and antioxidants. Then in 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived on the coast of Peru with fewer than 200 men. What followed is one of the most dramatic and catastrophic events in world history. The Inca Empire, which had taken centuries to build, collapsed in just a few years. Disease, particularly smallpox, had preceded the Spanish and had already killed millions of Inca people, including the emperor. The empire was already weakened. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire was swift and brutal. But it was not just military conquest, it was cultural destruction. The Spanish tried to erase everything that defined Inca civilization. The temples were destroyed. The quipus, the Inca writing system, were burned. The religious practices were banned, and the food was targeted too, because the Spanish understood that quinoa was at the heart of Inca identity. The Spanish actually banned the cultivation of quinoa in many regions. They imposed heavy fines on farmers who grew it. They destroyed quinoa fields and forced farmers to grow European crops like wheat and barley instead. Their reasoning was partly practical and partly ideological. They believed that quinoa's sacred status in Inca religion made it dangerous. A food connected to Inca gods could sustain Inca resistance, but the quinoa survived. In the most remote Andean communities, high in the mountains, far from Spanish administrative centers, indigenous families continued to grow quinoa quietly, secretly, generation after generation, keeping the seeds alive, keeping the knowledge alive of how to grow it, how to prepare it, how to celebrate it. The Spanish could ban fields near the roads and cities, but they could not patrol every mountain valley. For 400 years, quinoa remained almost entirely unknown outside the Andean highlands. Spanish colonizers ignored it. Later European scientists occasionally described it as a botanical curiosity, but nobody outside the region ate it. Nobody outside the region understood what it was or why it mattered. It existed in a food system that the outside world had decided did not count. Then in the 1970s, something began to shift. Two young Americans, Stephen Gorad and Don McKinley, were traveling in Bolivia and encountered quinoa for the first time. They ate it. They immediately understood that this was something extraordinary. They learned everything they could about it. And in 1982, they founded the Quinoa Corporation in the United States, the first company dedicated to bringing quinoa to the American market. The Quinoa Corporation faced enormous challenges. Most Americans had never heard of quinoa. They could not pronounce it. They did not know how to cook it. They did not know why they should want it. The first bags of quinoa, sold in American health food stores in the early 1980s, were met with curiosity, followed by confusion, and the packaging had to include pronunciation guidance. Quinoa. The breakthrough was slow, but steady. Health food advocates began championing quinoa for its extraordinary nutritional profile, complete protein, high in fiber, rich in minerals, gluten-free, at a time when gluten-free diets were becoming increasingly popular. Word spread through the health food community. Nutritionists began recommending it. Vegetarians discovered that here was a plant food that provided complete protein on its own. NASA got involved in quinoa's story in an unexpected way. In 1993, NASA scientists studying food for long-duration space missions identified quinoa as one of the most suitable crops for growing in space. Complete protein, high yield in small spaces, relatively easy to grow, adaptable to controlled environments. The grain of the Inca was being studied as the grain of astronauts. Then the United Nations took notice. In 2013, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, declared it the International Year of Quinoa. They called quinoa a food with high nutritive value, remarkable adaptability, and the potential to contribute to food security worldwide. In a world facing the challenge of feeding 9 billion people on a changing planet, the ancient Andean grain suddenly looked like part of the solution. The global quinoa boom that followed was extraordinary. In 2006, quinoa sold for about $1,000 per metric ton. By 2013, the price had risen to $3,000 per metric ton. It had tripled in price. For Andean farmers who had grown quinoa for subsistence for centuries, suddenly their ancient crop was worth serious money. But the quinoa boom had a dark side. As quinoa prices rose, local Andean communities who had eaten quinoa as their daily staple for generations found themselves priced out of their own food. They were growing quinoa to export because the money was good, but they could not afford to eat it themselves because the export price was higher than they could pay locally. Some journalists wrote articles arguing that Western demand for quinoa was causing malnutrition in Bolivia and Peru. The story spread globally. Quinoa lovers in New York and London felt guilty about eating it, but subsequent research was more complicated. Studies showed that the higher incomes from quinoa exports also improved local purchasing power overall. The truth was more nuanced than the headline suggested. Another concern was environmental. As quinoa prices rose, farmers in Bolivia expanded production into areas that had previously been grassland or scrubland. The llamas and alpacas that had grazed these lands were removed to make space for more quinoa fields. Without the animals, the natural fertilization that their dung provided was lost. Without careful rotation, soil quality began to decline. The Inca had known better. The Inca had practiced a sophisticated crop rotation system. They rotated quinoa with potatoes, with other Andean crops, and with fallow periods where the land rested. They integrated llamas, whose dung fertilized the fields. This system had worked sustainably for thousands of years. The disruption caused by sudden global demand had disturbed what was already a sophisticated, sustainable system. There was also a biopiracy concern. Quinoa has hundreds of varieties developed by Andean farmers over 7,000 years. This genetic diversity represents an incalculable agricultural heritage. In the 1990s, two American researchers patented a variety of quinoa that indigenous Andean farmers had developed. The Bolivian government protested. Eventually, the patent was withdrawn, but the incident raised important questions about who owns ancient agricultural knowledge. Peru and Bolivia have worked to protect their quinoa heritage in other ways. Both countries have registered many traditional quinoa varieties in international seed banks. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault. In Norway, the great insurance policy of world agriculture contains many Andean quinoa varieties. So even if catastrophe struck, the genetic diversity developed by Andean farmers over 7,000 years would survive. The quinoa story also intersects with climate change in a very direct way. Scientists are increasingly concerned about the ability of conventional crops to survive in the warmer, more variable climate conditions expected in coming decades. Quinoa, with its tolerance for drought, for frost, for altitude, for poor soil, for temperature extremes, is being studied as a potential future staple in regions where other crops will struggle. Kenya, Ethiopia, Morocco, India, scientists and farmers in many countries are now growing quinoa for the first time. They are adapting Andean varieties to their own climates and soils. In some cases, with remarkable success. The Inca grain, that could only survive at 4,000 meters, is being domesticated into new environments. Its extraordinary genetic flexibility is being asked to help feed the world of the future. Back in Bolivia and Peru, the quinoa story has evolved significantly since the boom years. Efforts have been made to improve fair trade practices, to support small farmers, to reintegrate traditional sustainable practices. Organic quinoa, grown using traditional Andean methods, commands premium prices on global markets. Some communities have been able to use quinoa income to fund schools, healthcare, and infrastructure. The story of quinoa is ultimately a story about resilience, a grain that survived 12,000 feet above sea level for 7,000 years. That survived Spanish conquest and colonial banning. That survived 4 centuries of being ignored by the outside world. That survived the volatility of its own boom. That is now being asked to survive on multiple continents, in changing climates. Quinoa has been tested every step of its journey. It has passed every test. From the shores of Lake Titicaca, 7,000 years ago, where ancient farmers first recognized something extraordinary in a wild plant, to the golden spade of the Inca emperor planting the sacred seeds in a ceremony watched by thousands, to the Spanish burning fields and banning a grain they did not understand but feared, to the hidden mountain gardens where it survived in secret, to 2 young Americans in Bolivia in the 1970s who saw what everyone else had missed, to the UN's declaration that what the Inca had known for 70 centuries was worth the world's attention, and to every bowl of quinoa being eaten right now, in restaurants and homes, on every continent, by people who may not know that they are eating the mother of all grains, the sacred food of the sun god, the grain that built an empire and survived everything that empire's conquerors could throw at it. Thank you for watching this story on Storia English. If you enjoyed learning English through this story, please subscribe to Storia English. Every week we bring you a new story from history, told in clear, slow, simple English, so you can improve your listening, vocabulary, and confidence, naturally, without stress. We will see you in the next story.